Good day, everyone. My name is Chris Jonas. I'm the Director of Communications at the National Association for Business Economics. We're pleased to present today's event, which is hosted by the NABE Policy Roundtable. Before we start, I did want to mention a few upcoming NABE events, including the NABE International Symposium, which will take place May 11th through 12th. Vice Chair Richard Clarida is slated to speak, amongst many others. Registration is free for NABE members, so make sure you're up to date on the membership dues, and you could register and become a NABE member at nabe.com. We're also excited to announce that the registration is available for the 18th Annual NABE Foundation Economic Measurement Seminar, which will take place virtually August 9th through 11th. We also have several upcoming NABE events, including a webinar on April 20th covering financing growth of women in minority-owned businesses. The experts will discuss opportunity zones, new market tax credits, and how federal policy can support stronger growth of women in minority-owned businesses. Okay, on to today's event. Please note that we'll have Q&A open throughout today's discussion. You could submit a question to the panelists at any time using the Q&A box. There will be one slide presentation accompanying today's event, and we'll be posting a link to that handout in the chat box. It's my pleasure now to introduce our moderator, former NABE Director, Ellen Zentner, Chief U.S. Economist with Morgan Stanley. Ellen, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. So today we've got a really timely panel for you and really an all-star cast in terms of the folks that really dig deeply into these policies. You know, the Biden administration has proposed the Build Back Better plan. There are really two parts to it. The first is the infrastructure spending program, which is the American Jobs Plan that we'll be most focused on today. And it's going to be partially funded by higher corporate taxes. And that comes in the American Family Plan. Both of those pieces are part of that Build Back Better program that is that should start moving through Congress shortly. So we're going to hear from three experts today: Doug Holtz-Eakin, President of the American Action Forum, formerly of the CBO Director; Diane Lim, who is the Adjunct Professor of Economics at the George Washington University, and she's also the co-chair of this NABE Policy Roundtable. And then Mark Zandi, who is the chief economist at Moody's Analytics and has been long looking at these types of economic impact legislations, a lot of work around multipliers. I've relied heavily on those multipliers over time as well in some of my economic impact work. So we've really got the best folks for you to talk about this American Jobs Plan today. So what I want to do is first call on each of them to provide 5 to 10 minutes of opening remarks just on, in general, how they're looking at this through the lens of an economist, its impact on the economy, maybe what are the best parts, the not so productive parts of this legislation, and really take it anywhere we'd like to take it. And again, as Chris let you know, you can submit questions into the Q&A box during our discussion, and we'll be getting to those a little bit later. So Mark, why don't we go ahead and start off with you?
Sure. Thanks, Ellen. Thanks for the opportunity. And NABE, thanks for the opportunity to address the group. It's a pleasure. Well, what do I like about the American Jobs Plan? I think it's a very good plan. It certainly addresses a key need, and that's our dilapidated and depreciating public infrastructure. And we've been underinvesting. If you go back into the 50s and 60s when we were building out the highway system, public infrastructure was approximately 6% of the nation's GDP. It's been more or less falling since then, and it's now about as low as it's been in the data that we have back to World War II. It's a little under 2%, and it continues to decline. And I think there's widespread agreement that infrastructure is key to business competitiveness and to productivity growth. And the fact that we've been underinvesting for so long is undermining our ability to achieve a higher growth rate. So the most obvious reason to be positive about the plan is it's addressing a very clear economic need. Second reason for being upbeat about the plan is I do think it's going to lead to a stronger economy. And as Ellen noted, we do a lot of fiscal policy analysis at Moody's, evaluating all kinds of economic proposals. And we've done the same for the AJP. We've simulated our model of the global economy, assuming the plan is implemented as the White House has scripted out. And I've written a small piece that's out there in the public domain that people can find. And I've got a slide for you. And if Chris pulls it up, Chris Jonas pulls it up, I'll show you. You can pull forward. This is just the bottom line. This is the difference in GDP, real GDP, billions of 2012 dollars. That's the blue line, left-hand scale, and employment. That's the green line, right-hand scale. The difference between GDP and jobs, assuming that we get the AJP passed later this year and implemented to script beginning in 2022, and compared to no AJP. So the baseline, the counterfactual is no AJP. And you can see it's decidedly positive. You get an immediate boost to GDP and jobs, really beginning in 23, 24. Interestingly enough, the corporate tax increases that are used to finance this kick in right away in 22. So it actually takes a little bit of steam out of the economy in 2022. And it's not really until we make our way into 23, 24, and particularly in the mid part of the decade, 25 and 26, when we get most of the support to growth. That's when most of the spending actually gets into the economy and starts to create jobs. You can see at the peak of the employment effects in 2026, it's close to 3 million jobs that are added. Mostly construction, manufacturing, transportation. There's a little bit of healthcare because there's a piece in there around elder care that I'll come back to in just a minute that adds as well. There's a bit of a lull as the spending starts to wind down, but you can see the level of GDP is now permanently higher. And I do think the increase in spending on infrastructure, which is about 1% of GDP over the 10-year budget horizon that I'm showing you here through 2030, that's sufficient enough to raise underlying productivity growth, trend productivity growth by about 0.1% by 2030. This does add to budget deficits on a static basis. By my calculation, it adds about $850 billion over the next 10 years. Less than that over a 15-year period. That's outside the CBO budget horizon, because the spending obviously goes away while the tax increases are still in place. So, 15 years out, it pays for itself. But in the first 10 years, about $850 billion. On a dynamic basis, it's about $675 billion. So it's still not inconsequential. It does add to interest rates, both because of the increased borrowing, but also because it lifts real underlying growth and thus real interest rates. So by 2030, the 10-year Treasury yield is about 10 basis points higher, 0.1 percentage points higher than it otherwise would have been. But net, adding it all up, we land in a pretty good place. It is financed by higher corporate taxes, and they are a negative, but in my mind, a very modest negative. The Trump tax cuts did very little to incent more investment, did hard to see any impact on productivity growth or long-term economic growth. I'm sure there is some that we'll be able to tease out a decade from now using econometrics, but it's on the margin. And as such, unwinding some of those tax cuts, I don't think will have any significant material impact, a negative impact on the economy. So the net of all this is very positive for the economy. Now, having said all of this, and Chris, you can take down the slide. I only had one slide to show. Is if I were king for the day, obviously I'd do something different. I might need a week, but if I had a day, I definitely would do some things different. I do feel that the elder care part of the package, as I'm sure you're all aware, the total package comes to about $2.6 trillion, $2.2 trillion in spending, $400 billion in tax credits. That 2.6 trillion includes about 400 billion, I believe, in so-called elder care for disabled people, which, obviously by itself is laudable. We do have a need there, but I don't consider that infrastructure. I mean, in my mind, infrastructure is investment that raises underlying productivity growth, and all of the other elements of the package, which are quite varied, everything from traditional transportation infrastructure to broadband, to power, water systems, are lift underlying productivity. The one other potentially controversial element of the plan is on housing, but in my view, that will lift productivity growth as well, because we have a very severe shortage of affordable housing, which is limiting the ability of workers to live close to where they work, particularly in highly productive urban areas across the country. And by investing in the supply side of the housing market and alleviating the supply shortages, that will reduce congestion and will also help lift long-term productivity growth. So I view that as infrastructure as well. But the elder care part of that, I think that's better left and should have been left for the American Family Plan. Although at the end of the day, these plans may come together anyway into one big plan. So I'm not sure that really makes a difference. Maybe legislatively, the AJP has a bit of an advantage over the next plan, the AFP, both of which will, again, probably come together. But I think that's more of a marginal argument. But if I were king, I probably would not have included that. It kind of muddies the messaging and the ability to articulate what this is all about. The second thing if I were king, I'd probably change is the funding sources. I don't think there's anything wrong with raising corporate taxes to pay for the bulk of this, because I do think large multinational corporations will be the prime direct beneficiaries of the plan. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And as I said, I don't think the negative macroeconomic consequences of that are very large. But I do think we should have thought of some other funding sources, like the gasoline tax seems like a slam dunk to me. It hasn't been increased since 1993. Now, I do get it from a political perspective. Raising gasoline tax will raise taxes on lower middle-income households, and President Biden made a promise not to do that. But I'm not sure from an economic perspective. And here I'm king, and I'm an economist. I don't have to worry about the politics of all of this. I think I would have done something different. Private public partnerships. I didn't see any of that. There's limited ability to use those. You need a fee structure, so it kind of limits what you can do. But why not? I think there's a lot of benefits to that, particularly around transportation infrastructures. And I think building out that capability would be very valuable in the future for future public infrastructure plans. So I think I probably would have included that. Carbon tax. I think carbon tax is probably a pretty good idea to address climate change. That would be the most direct way to do it. I can see the politics of not doing that here. Conflating the carbon tax with an infrastructure plan is probably a bridge too far, and so that's why it wasn't included. But again, I'm just an economist, and if I were an economist, I would seriously think about a carbon tax to help finance part of this, at least part of this. But all in all, despite those concerns and complaints, it's a good plan. And if I were a senator, I'd vote for it. Thank you, Ellen.
All right, great. Well, you've got my vote, Mark, if you ever do run for senator, although I don't think we're in the same.
Zero possibility of that. All
right. So Diane, I'd love to hear from you, because no doubt you take a different angle and study different parts of this as well. I'd love to hear your opening remarks, and also, just as Mark laid out, what do you think some of the best parts of this are, and what some of the least helpful parts might be?
Okay, thanks, Ellen. So I'm going to get to the "if I were queen" part, and I think you'll see that there are reasons why I might feel a little differently from Mark about the definition of infrastructure, what qualifies as infrastructure. So one thing I wanted to lead off with is this notion that, economists aren't really used to treating this kind of recession. We're more used to treating recessions that are caused by fundamental demand side weakness in the economy, and thinking about the economy as having a fixed productive capacity, or the supply side is there, we just need to get more of it to work. And we talk about, finding policies that have good demand side multiplier effects. Well, this is an economy, and this is a package where I think we have to start thinking of something that I think of as supply side multiplier effects, because we have experienced during this recession a lot of supply side, a lot of productive capacity that's been sidelined. And a lot of that sidelined capacity is capacity that economists aren't used to thinking about, because much of it is invisible, because it might be not in the marketplace, it might be stuck at home, or it might be undervalued because it's stuck in underpaid jobs, because they're the kinds of jobs that women and minorities disproportionately hold. So I would argue that we need to think about the potential for the supply side growth of our economy. And as economists, we need to be a little bit humble about what we do and do not understand about the potential supply side of the economy. You know, we have studied, economists study the economy and model the economy based on historical market data, right? And so anything that's not in the market, we don't really see the data that can help us predict how that part of the economy will react to change in policy. There's something far more fundamental, I think, going on in this economy than what economists are used to studying. So, you know, I've been a tax economist for most of my career. I've built tax models where we analyze the general equilibrium effects of tax policy on economic behavior. But all those models are parameterized and calibrated to historical, largely macroeconomic data. And when you parameterize a model to aggregate and average data, you are missing a lot of the richness of the economy that actually matters a lot, because maybe it's a small part of the economy, but it's moving the most. And so if you think about you know, what we've seen in terms of what's been labeled the she-cession of this pandemic recession, a lot of that is seeing non-market work done at home, caregiving, take priority over market-based work, especially for women. I think that as we're thinking about the effects of this American Jobs Plan on the economy, and as we're worrying about, is this too much? Is this going to overheat the economy? I think we have to realize that economists don't really have a very good read on what potential GDP actually looks like. And I think because we've never seen an economy with all these supply side multipliers like fully turned on, I think it's silly to scoff at the notion that caregiving or the care economy is not infrastructure and will not add to the productivity of the economy. You know, I think that I look at it as, how can we overheat parts of the economy that haven't even made it to the stovetop? You know, it's like, so how can we worry about things that we're not even looking at and paying attention? If you think about the baselines that are set in all the economic models, whether it be CBO's model or any other model, the baseline is built upon the economy we've observed, which is essentially a white male dominated economy. White people make up the vast majority of the population. So when you look at unemployment statistics, white people are dominating that aggregate measure. White male people are dominating the market value, the dollar valued measures of GDP, because they earn the most money. So we are not getting a good read on the entire economy by setting up baselines in our economic models calibrated to aggregate and average data. Now, you know, this recession has been like no other because of these adverse effects we've seen on the supply side of the economy. And so I think that that's the best thing about what the Biden administration has proposed as their approach to encouraging a healthy recovery or building back better. I think it's not just focused on the traditional demand side policy of throw money out there or build infrastructure, build stuff just to create shovel-ready, you know, projects where labor will be demanded right away. So two things that I really like about the Biden BBB infrastructure / jobs plan are, first, that the focus on supply side, on the infrastructure spending, is not just because it's something good for stimulating demand. It's because it is something that contributes to the supply side productive capacity of the economy, as Mark has highlighted with his estimates. And second, there's a recognition in this package that this kind of government spending that has lasting benefits and that has lasting contribution to productivity, it should be worth paying for. It should feel easy to make the trade-off between higher tax rates, higher marginal tax rates, and these kinds of investments that probably will pay off by more than the higher marginal tax rates hurt economic activity. And it should be worth paying for with debt as well, because it's a good time to borrow. Let's face it, interest rates are still low. If our returns on our investments in infrastructure, however broadly we define it, are going to be high, then it makes sense to borrow. So paying now or paying later just makes sense. Two aspects that I'll be a little bit more critical of, or if I were queen for the year, I guess, I think that the notion of infrastructure in the package we've seen already from the Biden administration is still very much focused on building things. It's still very focused on the traditional structures view of infrastructure. And it seems a little stuck in this idea, and I know why they do it, because it's a bridge. It's sort of a bipartisan bridge that are to what Republicans and Democratic policymakers all love is infrastructure. It's hard to disagree with, but it seems stuck on this notion that, the saying, if we build it, the people will come. I don't know exactly where that came from, but it's this notion that building infrastructure, building the structures to hold people will bring the people to those structures. And I actually think that I would have rather seen the Biden administration lead with the people, the more people intensive infrastructure that economists and policymakers are kind of laughing at right now. But I think that the people part of the infrastructure and supporting families and providing a way for women and minorities and the people that we don't see very much in the market economy participate more in the economy would actually do much more to build the economic foundation of our productive capacity. Second, economists and policymakers are focused on the downside of this bill being raising corporate taxes. I just think that the disincentive effects of higher corporate tax rates are extremely small compared to the potential for the returns on investment for what these increased revenues will pay for. And so I think that, I wish there was not this emphasis on, oh, well, all this stuff that's for families is just a nice thing to do. And it's, a way to make the economy more equitable and inclusive. It's not just a nice thing to do, it's actually a smart thing to do. So I wish that there would be a lot more emphasis from economic experts and from policymakers, a lot more recognition that these kinds of spending are actually better for productivity than the tax cuts were in 2017. So that's my opening.
So I love that, taking a lot of different angles on it from Mark, but there is something that I noticed you two do agree on, which is the corporate tax increase is small compared to the benefits of the spending parts of the plan, because there is a lot of undue concern around that. I notice on raising corporate taxes, almost like that negates the whole rest of the plan. But Doug, would love to get your thoughts. There were quite a few things said here that were on the budget side of it, of course, but your opening remarks and maybe also working in there what you think are the most helpful parts of the Build Back Better and what could be improved upon.
Sure. So if you look at the American Jobs Plan, I think the easy thing to endorse is the transportation infrastructure. And I wish there was more of it, quite frankly. I think that they could have gone heavier on that and that we would benefit the most from that being the emphasis. No great objection to that at all. I would have preferred that it be financed with a heavier use of user fees, as we often do with infrastructure. I mean, ports are easily user feed. You can build fee structures into some of the surface transportation. You can use a vehicle miles tax, which is the future, and we just got to decide to go to the future. And so I think that was very light on the user fee financing, which has the virtue of typically economically rationalizing the use of that infrastructure. You don't overuse and underuse. If you have to have a fee structure, it builds the reserves for maintaining the infrastructure. It makes a lot of sense from a life cycle point of view. And in those circumstances, you can also go to the public-private partnerships that Mark mentioned, and which have been very successful. So I like that part of the plan. It could have been better. I think there's no question about that. I am not a fan of two things in particular. The inclusion of the PRO Act is just a horrific policy error. I mean, the PRO Act's a bad piece of legislation. It has nothing to do with infrastructure. The idea that we're going to ban the joint employer model, reclassify every independent contractor as an employee, and preempt right to work laws across the country. There's nothing about that is good for growth, good for infrastructure or anything. And it's I think just a flat policy error. It shouldn't be in there. I'm also not a fan of the corporate tax financing, and I'm not a fan because if you dial the clock back to 2014, 15, 16, two things were true. Number one, the U.S. had the highest statutory rate, corporate tax rate in the developed country world, and a reliance on the global taxation of its multinationals' profits, a worldwide tax system. When we were the last developed country clinging to worldwide taxation, that policy regime was accompanied by a steady stream of inversions and other relocations of corporations abroad, and a political furor and heavy regulatory activity by the Treasury to try to stop it. And we talked about Benedict Arnold firms, and it was a constant thorn in the U.S. side. That's gone, and it's gone for a very simple reason. The corporate rate is no longer out of line. It's in the middle of the pack, and we are no longer overly reliant on worldwide taxation system. We've moved toward a more territorial, if imperfect, I don't want to defend it to the T, but corporate tax system. That was something on a bipartisan basis, something that a Rob Portman and a Charles Schumer agreed on in 2016, and we got closer to it in 2017. It makes no sense to me to unwind that. And that's what we would do. 28 would be out of line with our developed country competitors. A global tax at 21 doesn't do us any good. And then to add on a tax on book income, I mean, that's just a very bad proposition. Mixing GAAP accounting with tax accounting makes no sense whatsoever. So the corporate tax provisions are just bad tax policy at this point in time. If you want to raise corporate taxes, broaden the base, get rid of interest deductibility, do something that makes some sense. But don't do this. This is the wrong set of proposals in my view. So I'm not a big fan of that. I do think there's an important question about how you evaluate this. And then they teed up the evaluation by calling it the American Jobs Plan. So we should evaluate it on jobs, but that doesn't make any sense to me. If you think about the appropriate policy baseline, which is kind of an issue, but the baseline right now is an economy coming out of this pandemic recession where supply restrictions are the key characteristic, and the coronavirus produces those restrictions. Let's assume those go away by the mid 2023, when the Mark's charts suggest this hits. It's also true that stacked ahead of it is the American Rescue Plan, a 1.9 trillion overstimulus of the U.S. economy. So there's no cyclical recovery of jobs to be credited to this bill. By the time it gets passed and implemented, that's long since happened. And so the only way to get jobs out of it is to, in the long run, raise the participation rate of men, which I don't really see happening much in this, or women, perhaps, if you get a serious expansion of the child care supply side, which is in here, which I want to give them credit for. No one ever expands the supply of child care. They just subsidize the demand and let's raise the price. So that they finally got that squared away. But it's hard for me to see how this creates a lot of jobs. Now, you got some jobs, Mark, so I'm going to ask you to tell me how at some point. I don't really understand that. So I wouldn't evaluate it that way. You might evaluate it on productivity increases and thus real wage increases, standard of living. That'd be a sensible economic metric. But I don't think this would really do that, right? We know that private investments about 10% return, infrastructure is about 5, maybe I think Mark goes to 7. I think that's on the high side. So if you had a disciplined infrastructure plus tax plan, you might break even. But if you add in the Medicaid expansion and a lot of the other things in here, that's not going to be a long run productivity winner. So that doesn't look very promising to me. Now, it has to be said that you can look at this from many different perspectives. Well, like one of its flaws, I think, is that it's trying to be too many things to too many people. But another perspective on this is it's really not about the economy. It's not about jobs. It's not about productivity. It's about climate. And so we have clean energy in there. We do renovation of public housing to make it more energy efficient. We build electricity infrastructure that I think probably the private sector would build. I don't understand why we're putting in this bill, but you can do that. And those are going to be non-productivity social benefits that you might want to credit to it. But you have to make that case, and no one's making that case right now. So I think there are some tough issues in evaluating this from a benefit cost point of view. Like, what are we really getting for what we're putting into this bill?
Thanks, Doug. So there's a lot here. We've got questions that have been coming in, and again, if you want to submit a question, you can submit that in the Q&A box. I'm going to start off with a few here as well, but I can already see that there are some great questions that have come in. And Doug, I want to stay with you for a moment here to start off. You know, Mark had mentioned, he had talked about his numbers and said one of the set of numbers was on a dynamic basis.
Yep.
What is that? That's referring to dynamic revenue scoring. What does that mean? What has been our sordid history at the federal and state level of dynamic scoring? When does it make sense? When does it not? Does the CBO still do it? Why would we care about sort of what the dynamic estimate could be in a broad reaching policy package like this?
Sure. So scoring is the act of taking a piece of legislation, comparing it to a baseline outlook for the economy and the budget, and answering the question, how much does this legislation increase or decrease revenues coming into the Treasury and spending going out? And that's what scoring does. And it's important to recognize that scoring is different than forecasting, because to do scoring, you have to do it consistently across alternative proposals and over time so that you can get apples to apples comparisons. And so to do scoring, you fix the baseline. CBO typically fixes the baseline with its economic forecast and the current law for the budget in March of each year. And regardless of what happens, you go on and keep scoring against that baseline, so that a score you do in August is the same as one in October, which is the same as the one you did back in March. They're all comparable. For that reason, you often don't get a forecast of the impact of the law, because conditions can change radically from, say, March to April in a year, like last year. And so that's scoring. And what the typical bill does is so little to the economy that you don't pay attention to the fact that it would have some macroeconomic feedbacks. So most scoring is, quote, static scoring. There are going to be circumstances where you have a large proposal and you want to take into account changes in the overall state of the economy, increases in economic growth, decreases in economic growth, and that's dynamic scoring. And we've done dynamic scoring at the CBO. Every president's budget is dynamically scored. Many large bills have been in the past. This would be a candidate to be dynamically scored. It's $2.6 trillion impact. That's a big bill. It's going to have a chance to move the trajectory of the economy. And you'd like to know that information in both doing the budgetary impacts and also from a policy analysis point of view. It is the case right now that they have taken out of the House and the Senate rules any provision for dynamic scoring. The only official scores are static scores. So I don't think we'll see a CBO dynamic score of any piece of the American Jobs Plan or its successor, the American Family Plan.
Thank you. So, Mark, maybe one for you. When Doug was providing his comments, he talked about, this most recent package that we had gotten, saying $1.9 trillion over stimulus. And I'm not asking anyone to take, Larry Summers' side or Paul Krugman's side on whether we've done enough or too little. If we're thinking about, just the Build Back Better plan, how are you thinking about, you did talk about productivity in your opening remarks, but when you have, companies talking about lack of supply of labor now and labor costs rising, but you've got productivity gains, but possibly coming later, which might help alleviate that. I mean, how are you thinking about that as a temporal effect in your forecast, that there are these supply issues around labor and labor costs now, but productivity could be alleviating that later?
Well, in my view, we still have considerable slack in the economy. We have a 6% unemployment rate. we've got several million people who've stepped out of the workforce altogether and not being counted as unemployed. And of course, labor force participation is low as a result.
Mm-hmm.
With the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, plus a $900 billion fiscal relief plan that was passed at the end of the year, by my calculation, we don't quite get back to full employment by the end of 2022. We still have slack. We're pretty close to a 4% unemployment rate. Labor force participation is up about 0.5 point from where it is today. But that's, by my calculation, of full employment is probably somewhere between 3 and 3.5%. And labor force participation somewhere around 63%. EPOP for prime age workers somewhere around 80. So that means we still have some more room, and that's where the American Job Plan comes in. And the AJP lowers unemployment by almost 0.5 point, raises labor force participation by a little over 0.5 point. You do the arithmetic, that's how you get 2.5, 3 million jobs out there in 2030. So
Okay.
Interestingly enough, this is just per chance, I guess, or maybe the administration did a similar kind of calculation. The arithmetic works out well. It's exactly to script. If it sticks to script, obviously, as Diane points out, we got to be humble here. A lot of moving parts, and things are going to happen between now and then for sure. Probably going to happen tomorrow. So if things stick roughly to script, it feels like it's a pretty good script.
Yeah, Doug, response to that?
Well, I was just surprised that at the end of 2022, he still wasn't back to full employment. That explains it. I mean, I think we will be. That seems like a very, very slow response. And again, my script is that we actually relieve ourselves entirely of the restrictions of the pandemic, the sort of self-quarantining withdrawal that people do, the formal lockdowns that people imposed. I think the former is the bigger behavioral issue. So that goes away so that we can get labor supply into sectors of the economy where we can't right now. We can get people into restaurants and hotels and things like that. So those are gone. And the American Rescue Plan, which is 1.9 trillion in a year, is sufficient to eliminate any cyclical slack. I think it's more than sufficient. Let me finish. And the reason I think that is that, again, nobody's numbers are perfect, but the CBO numbers put us at the end of 2020 somewhere in the vicinity of 500 billion or so below potential. It's a $1.9 trillion package. You don't have to have the world's biggest multiplier to get to yes. So I just don't see how we end up at the end of 2022 with that much slack. But if it is true, then Mark's arithmetic makes perfect sense. The key is what you believe about impacts on productivity and thus the ability to draw people into the labor force. That is everything. And where you land on that really dictates where you end up on the package, I think.
Can I just quickly say, just to frame, this is the way I kind of frame things. The ARP is really about getting as close to full employment as we possibly can. And you're right, Doug, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we get a little more juice. But the Build Back Better agenda, the American Jobs Plan and the forthcoming American Family Plan, that's really about the supply side of the economy, in my view. AJP is mostly productivity. It does result in more labor force participation because you have a high intensity economy, higher wages, better jobs, and you're going to get more labor force participation. But it's mostly about labor productivity. But the AFP, which is coming, that's about labor force participation, childcare, family leave, healthcare. These are things that will free up, particularly women, to get into the workforce at a higher rate of participation. So the frame here is, and maybe we can debate the arithmetic all day long, but the frame is a good frame. The frame is ARP is about getting us back to full employment. And by the way, everyone back to full employment, not just, the lowest income, lesser skilled, less educated. We want a high intensity, rip roaring economy to get those people back to work. And then the Build Back Better agenda is let's build this back so we get a higher rate of underlying potential rate of growth going forward. And if you have that frame, then we can debate the merits of it and we can adjust it around. But I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about it. It's a pretty, you think about it that way, you go, oh, this makes a lot of sense.
So there we've got.
No, I would disagree. I think you can think about it that way, but then you wouldn't do all the climate stuff. The climate stuff are costs you impose on the economy that will not have it grow faster, but which have a policy virtue. I mean, you're doing it for climate purposes. And so if that's the purpose, take that stuff out, right? Reworking the supply side is a costly adjustment. And that's not how you do just a quick cyclical recovery. If you want a quick cyclical recovery, keep the structure the same, get everyone back in.
Well, so let's because I think there's some interesting aspects to that we can come back to, but we've
both back. We'll keep going. We can go back and forth a couple.
I know, right? Yeah.
We're gonna pretend to comply, but we're gonna fight.
So Diane, a few things here were mentioned that you've studied very closely. Rising labor force participation, getting into the most underserved parts of the labor market, how impactful that could be. And I often wonder if, those are the harder parts of a plan to pass through Congress or get approval in Congress, because we don't have concrete multipliers, and the multipliers apply to policies that are so well outside of any legislator's time in Congress, right? We all want immediate impacts, whereas some of these policies are much longer run policies. I think back to the, in the Reagan years, granting amnesty to up to 3 million undocumented immigrants, and how we have been enjoying the fruits of that today, even with our demographics our demographic lift in the U.S. So go back to, or maybe try to tie in how we should think about the parts that really could work most effectively to raise those underserved parts of the labor market in terms of labor force participation. And in particular, how that might play into the fact that we've now got the Fed and the White House working together in terms of this maximum employment mandate, which goes much further than just let's get the unemployment rate lower. It's let's look under the hood and make sure we're really making progress on disparities like Black versus white unemployment rates and labor force participation rates of women versus men. So walk us through some more of your thoughts around the most impactful pieces of this, and why do we care about making sure it's not just higher labor force participation, but higher labor force participation among these underserved groups?
Right. So I think that what we've learned from the pandemic experience is that a lot of conditions affect people's ability to fully participate in the market economy. And that's why we saw the SHE session. We realized for the first time that working parents rely a lot on having schools open for their kids to go to, that they rely a lot on having safe places for their elderly parents to live, at all times, even during a pandemic. Otherwise, they're going to have to bring them home and take care of them themselves. So I think that what is helpful in building out the supply side of the economy, as Mark noted, that this American Jobs Plan is intended to do, not just stimulate demand. I think that what's helpful is anything that allows this labor supply to be freed up. And by freed up, I mean that, especially with working mothers, I think that women should have the resources to decide to stay at home and take care of the kids themselves, or to afford high quality childcare to be able to feel good about going back to their market jobs. Both Doug and Mark have studied the effects of immigration reform, I know, and it's the same kind of idea. It's like, there's so much untapped labor productivity, human productivity that's out there. And if we just look at our old baselines, economic baselines about what is full employment, we're going to miss a lot of the potential for growth in the supply side of the economy. And so I'm kind of making a plea to all economists and policymakers that we have to think a little bit more broadly about what we're trying to do with this recovery package. It isn't just about getting us back to the old full employment. It's about trying to figure out how full we can get in full employment and potential GDP. So I think any policy that kind of expands our horizons, like what our economy does, what we produce. I think even like climate change policy can be viewed as pushing out the productivity frontier, because it's getting us to build different things and to, engage in different sorts of economic activity that can create more jobs and that can create more, market work for people. So, yeah, I think that we've seen that a lot of the segments of the economy that have the most potential to push out our productivity frontier are actually segments of the economy that we haven't seen before. So we haven't seen what it does to expand immigration. We haven't seen what it would do to provide child allowances or elder parent allowances to families, to give them more resources to find their highest valued use, whether it's at home or in the marketplace. So this is the kind of policy that I think is fairly revolutionary in terms of affecting our economists' notion of what it takes to build a, stronger, not just a recovered economy, but a stronger, more resilient economy going forward.
Thanks, Diane. Let me just stay with you for a moment here, because there was a question that came in. And I think it's interesting because, and this is an argument that I think we probably will hear often. If we look at the underlying unemployment dynamics in the US pre-COVID, we had headline unemployment rate of 3.5%. If you looked under the hood, the minority unemployment rates were at historic lows prior to the pandemic. And of course, a large destruction of the jobs during COVID hit those very demographics because we were shutting down the service sector, we were closing schools, and as we disseminate the vaccine, as those activities are opening up again, and that comes back, well, where you've lost the majority of jobs is where you're going to bring back the most jobs. And so won't it look to folks as though pretty soon here, we're going to be making improvements hand over fist because those are the jobs we're bringing back. How do you convince folks that, what would you say to folks that say, well, we are getting some big improvements there? Is this that we've always needed to go beyond what we were doing before? Maybe because we never had the right policies in place, even pre-COVID, even as good as the economy had looked then?
Yeah. I think the goal should not be, let's just get back to where we were in February 2020. I think that we've learned from when we were bottoming out during this pandemic recession what we didn't like about how the economy used to be, because we saw that the workers that were most vulnerable to loss of employment and to having to, to having to stay at home were disproportionately female people of color, right, and younger people. And so I think that the goal is to free up the labor supply of those groups that were adversely affected. If you think about the disproportionate burden on people who are working in leisure hospitality, and just think about the nature of those jobs. It's not great employment, but it's flexible employment. A lot of women work leisure hospitality jobs. A lot of young people take leisure hospitality jobs. Working mothers often take part-time leisure hospitality jobs because it allows them the flexibility to juggle family responsibilities with work responsibilities. It allows them to fit it into their schedules essentially, but those jobs are part-time, usually part-time jobs without benefits. And that's been something that the pandemic has highlighted, is that those people that were most likely to lose their jobs, they were also the people that didn't have, paid leave for childcare. They didn't have health insurance, and that's why the rescue packages had to be so big, because really they didn't have their own safety nets provided by their employers. And my thought is people worried about things being too generous to them, but so what? It's like, what are they going to do with it that's going to be so bad for the economy in terms of, people weren't rushing out to spend their unemployment benefits. They were saving them because they knew the unemployment would not last forever and would not even last as long as they were unemployed. So yeah, I think we are close to getting back to normal, to normal, what it was in February of 2020, but I don't think that should be our goal anymore. I think we should aim higher based on what we've learned.
Thank you. So Doug, one for you, and then Mark, I've got some questions that have come in for you in terms of the type of modeling that you did. Doug, in the CBO's work, they found that an average annual rate of return on government investment is about half that of private investment. If we talk about, closing the output gap sooner than previously thought because of the American Rescue Plan, for instance, does the AGP create a potential for crowding out of private investment? And wouldn't that presumably sort of dumb down, if you will, not a great term, but dumb down, you will, if the overall impact of this?
So the way I think about it is I take out of it the evaluation any cyclical benefits. I think those are a bonus. I think they'll largely be gone. Maybe Mark's right. We'll get something from that, but put that in a separate category, any sort of bonus you get out of the cyclical recovery. And just think of it as, what are we giving up in the private sector and what are we getting in the public sector? And if you imagine this as just moving $1 of investment from the private sector to the public sector, you're losing some long run rate of return. And the important thing there is it doesn't matter how you move it. So everyone always says, oh, interest rates are low, it's a good time to do this. It doesn't matter how you move it. It's a loss. You're moving it from a higher productivity employment to a lower productivity use. And you can do it with taxes or borrowing. So you then have to say, is there a benefit above and beyond that makes that worthwhile? In some cases there are. So you can make the case on climate benefits, that might be fine. You might have a productivity benefit that comes out of that, which we haven't seen before. That's Diane's argument, that you can't look historically and find the labor force participation benefits that are going to come from that. But that's the evaluation you have to do. And so I think the straight evaluation is it's a negative. And you have to convince me there are these other benefits that someone's not identified to make it worthwhile. I also am concerned that we are building in a larger structural deficit. We had a big deficit problem coming into the pandemic. Everything that was done in 2020 made sense to me because it was large, pretty well timed and temporary. Didn't change the baselines at all once you went out a couple of years. The character of the American Rescue Plan, the American Jobs Plan, and the as yet unreleased American Family Plan has been completely different. There's a lot of intent to make permanent changes, and they're not adding up. And so I worry about that. And all of that leads to crowding out.
Thanks. But this Build Back Better plan is going to pay for itself, Doug. Dynamic scoring.
Nothing pays for itself. Write that down. Nothing pays for itself.
I know. I've certainly been modeling. So Mark, in the time that we've got left here, I think Doug did a good job of laying out sort of how burdensome a 28% corporate tax rate would be in terms of removing our competitiveness on the global stage. Joe Manchin, a moderate Democrat, West Virginia, has talked about sort of his ceiling for what he would vote for being 25% on corporate taxes because that would keep the U.S. competitive. In your modeling, have you just taken the Build Back Better as proposed at face value and run that through your model? Or have you made some assumptions in there of just how high corporate taxes would be able to go, or and let other pieces fall out that might not make it through the moderate Democrats to passage?
No, that simulation, the results I showed you were based on taking the package as laid out by the White House in their fact sheet a week or so ago. We can do, we can do it and change the assumptions and see what happens, but it's exactly what they proposed. The corporate tax, all else being equal, higher corporate taxes in my results are negative. They're just a small negative. And it's very consistent with the, if you go back to the TCGA, the tax cut under Trump, all the work that was done, CBO and all the other analysts, and you take a look at the benefit of the lower tax rates, this is exactly, just put a minus sign in front of it. My estimates are right in the middle of the distribution, very close to CBO. And my sense is that the impacts are probably overstated at this point, because we can see from TCGA that there's no evidence that it looked at underlying investment or productivity growth, and the intuition is pretty clear. The cost of capital, the availability of capital, is not a constraint on the ability of businesses to invest. It's just not. I mean, interest rates are very low. There's cash everywhere. There's capital everywhere. So that is not a constraint. So lowering the cost of capital doesn't give you much. Yes, in a neoclassical investment function, you're going to get a impact, but it's very, very small. Here's another point on the benefit of public infrastructure. CBO in that 2015, I think it's 2015. And Doug, were you director in 2015? I can't remember. No, it was after your time.
Doug.
Yeah, Doug Elmendorf. So the private investment they said 10%. They said public infrastructure all blended in because there's all kinds of public infrastructure, R&D and everything else, 5%. But 3% of that is just simply the idea that state and local governments are going to invest less if the feds invest more. So their actual estimate is 8% on the investment, but they take away 3 percentage points because state and locals are going to invest less. I don't think that's going to be the case this go around, because the kind of infrastructure we're talking about here is not your bridges and roads. It's a plethora of things that state and local governments aren't doing. And moreover, state and local governments, because of the ARP, most of them are now flush. They're trying to figure out what to do with the money. So their investment's actually going to increase. It's not going to decrease. And the other big difference between the 10% private investment and the 8% CBO, apples to apples, is that the federal public infrastructure goes to things that are based on things that are not directly economic. They're not making calculations based on return on investment. They're based on social needs and federal public infrastructure and schools. And so if you do it apples to apples, you come up with the same thing, and it makes a lot of intuition. And by the way, the final thing I'd say is, because we've been so under investing in public infrastructure for decades, we got a lot of low-hanging fruit here. I could take a map of the United States, put it up there in front of me, take a dart, throw it. Anywhere I go, I can run a circle around a 3-mile circumference, and I can find a project that's going to give you a higher return than the current 10-year treasury you'll buy 2 or 3 times. So we've got a lot of low-hanging fruit here that we can get some really good returns on. So this argument that we're going to take $1 from the private sector and give it to the public sector and we're going to lose out is, in my view, just wrong.
And well, finally, just another minute here, and anyone can step in here. I mean, what could, when we start to do the horse trading on this policy as it moves through Congress, what could make it more impactful in the near term? You've got the higher taxes that would be stretched out over a 10-year budget window. Could we see something like that infrastructure, that $2 trillion plus on infrastructure, rather than being stretched out over a 10-year window, maybe lump it into 5 or 7 years? Is that something typically that we would see in the horse trading around this?
Yeah, so this is now a political economy question. What should we expect to see, come out of this process? Now, what should we see? Kind of a positive versus normative question.
Yeah.
My sense is we're going to get a package that's pretty close to what's been proposed here. At the end of the day, I can't imagine the Democrats walking away from this opportunity to game-changing legislation. It's going to be a game changer. Yeah, it's going to be on the margin. Manchin's going to have an impact, and maybe it's 25% or not 28. But I'd be pretty surprised if we don't get a package that looks in size and scope similar to what we're getting. In fact, I built that into my baseline. So now I'm assuming Build Back Better agenda of $3 trillion, $2.5 trillion will be paid for over 10 years. That's in my baseline forecast. And I've raised my long-term growth projection by 15 basis points per annum. It was 1.9% per annum over the next 10 years. Underlying growth potential is now 2. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but over a period of a decade or generations, it's a lot of money, 2.05% per annum. So I've changed my baseline as a result of this proposal.
I agree that most of this is gonna happen, and that any compromise is going to be sort of a little tinkering around the edges, probably with the marginal tax rate on corporations. Oh, Ellen, you're muted.
Sorry, primarily because it's reconciliation. Well, I would imagine. All right, Doug, you think big chunks of this get swept away? No.
I think that given the bandwidth of any Congress, there's going to be one more bill. It's going to go in reconciliation. And so there's some combination of this and the as yet unreleased American Family Plan that will form that bill. Some pieces will probably drop out as a result. And I've seen the administration being willing to compromise on the financing because they really don't care if they borrow at all. And so they won't negotiate on what spending goes in, and they'll borrow it all if they need to.
Great. All right. Well, Doug, Mark, Diane, thank you so much for joining me. Important discussion will continue to play out over the course of the year. This has been fantastic. Thanks to everyone who joined and the incredible amount of questions that we got. We weren't able to get to them all, but I hope everyone found this useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for joining today. As a reminder, recordings of past NABE webinars are available on the NABE Connect app. They are also available on NABE.com and the NABE.com digital archive for members. Thank you all again for participating in today's webinar. Today's program is copyright 2021 by the National Association for Business Economics with all rights reserved, and this does conclude the event. Thank you all. We'll see you next time.